Hello, back again. This is Christian Martinson here with Dr. James Spencer via phone, and we are on the topic of wisdom literature and now getting into poetry, and we're going to touch on the Psalms here a little bit. But to start us off, James, I want to talk a little bit about Old Testament poetry versus modern poetry. You want to put that in a context for us?
Yeah, I think Old Testament poetry and modern poetry do have some similarities, particularly in their use of imagery. You know, obviously both sets of poetry use imagery. But second, they're also designed to kind of engage the reader emotionally. And that is a characteristic of both. Obviously the differences, modern poetry has a broader purpose than Old Testament poetry. Specifically, Old Testament poetry is designed to elicit theological points, really engage readers and give them an experience of God that the narrative really doesn't, whereas modern poetry has much broader purpose. They do different things with their poetry. The other thing with modern poetry, in a lot of modern poetry, I shouldn't say all modern poetry, but in modern poetry, we've come to expect, sort of rhymes and word plays and different things like that. Hebrew's primary mechanisms for making a poem are not rhyming. They do utilize some word plays. They do utilize some things like assonance, where they use multiple consonantal sounds to draw the reader in. But by and large, it just isn't. It isn't common to see Hebrew using a rhyme.
And either way, us as an English reader is not going to be able to pick up on much of those dynamics of the language unless we're reading the original Hebrew, just for those in the audience that may not understand that. And that's even something, when you agree that as you learn some of the aspects of the original language of Hebrew and that sort of thing, you can pick up on some actually beautiful dynamics of what the language and the writer is doing that you can't actually oftentimes pick up when you read the English translation. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and that's one of the big reasons that I think Hebrew is valuable in the study of the Old Testament, is particularly poetry. We can do a really great job translating narrative, but sometimes poetry is just really difficult to show how it all fits together.
No, that's good. Did you get through most of the characteristics that you wanted to discuss there when I interrupted you, or how are you feeling on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think we'll get through some of the other specific characteristics as we move forward. So.
Okay. Yeah, so I kind of wanted to get into the idea of reading the Old Testament poetic books. Are there certain steps or a mindset that you would want a reader to have as they address Old Testament poetry in particular?
Yeah, there really are. I think particularly for the English reader, one of the primary things that you can do is use a version comparison. Some translations do a really excellent job of translating poetry. Others not so much.
Right.
But just like in any translation, you have different sorts of translations, different purposes for translations, and so comparing different translations can actually be a really great way to get at what the sense of a text is, or what the possibilities might be for interpreting that text. And so I would really suggest that as sort of the first step. The second step, I would say, you have to start looking at the parallelism. Parallelism is pretty much the sort of sine qua non of all Old Testament poetry. And what we mean by parallelism is that multiple lines within a poem, usually two, reinforce one another in some way. And so, if you look at maybe like Psalm 23, the first line is, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." Well, the Lord is my shepherd tells me something. It sort of uses this image of God as a shepherd protecting sheep. It has resonances with, aid and care and really security. And that's what a shepherd did for his sheep. Well, but then the second line really adds some specificity to the image. It tells me what I'm supposed to be focused on. I lack nothing. It takes me out of this, well, shepherd can be royal imagery. Well, maybe it is in this case, but really what the psalmist is asking me to focus on is contained in this
That's
The
good.
Lord is a shepherd so well
Mm-hmm.
that I don't really want for anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how parallelism works. It can reinforce itself in a number of different ways. There can be sort of a progression from one concept to another. If we look at the next line in Psalm 23, he takes me to lush pastures, he leads me to refreshing water.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, you move from sort of this eating imagery to water imagery, and that gives you an all-encompassing feel for now what God does.
Yeah.
So examining those parallels is extremely important when you're looking at poetry. And then the final step I'll mention is examination of figurative language. Mm-hmm. This really can pay off, and sometimes you have to do some digging to understand what the imagery is. But even as we look at, again, I'll go back to Psalm 23 and the reference to the shepherd. Mm-hmm. Shepherding imagery can have numerous resonances. It's used in many different ways in the Old Testament, including royal imagery. But it also has those ideas of safety and security and provision and all these different things.
Right.
And so it pays to really understand what the images are doing and why they're there.
Yeah.
Why is the psalmist using them? What could they be communicating? How are they used elsewhere? Those are all really good questions to ask as you're looking at a poem.
Great. Yeah. Now, if you're looking at reading a psalm and reading poetry that's elsewhere in the Old Testament, perhaps like the historical books and that sort of thing, how would you approach the differences between poetry in the Psalms and poetry in, let's say, Samuel or Kings or something of that nature?
Yeah. Obviously, when poetry occurs in an Old Testament narrative, it's obvious. Mm-hmm. The fonts and indentation patterns in your Bible change, and you recognize that you're reading something different. Usually when poetry occurs in narrative literature, it's extremely important because, as we've talked about in previous lectures, narrative doesn't always use descriptive terms, and they use dialogue at a minimum.
Yeah.
And so when we're looking at Old Testament poetry in a narrative section, what we should say is, okay, I need to pay big time attention to this because it's going to tell me something important here.
Yeah.
I think of Hannah's poem at the beginning of Samuel and the way it talks about the rise and fall of nations and God's role in that. Mm-hmm. Very much resonates with the rest of the theology of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Mm-hmm. And then I also think of David's prayer when he finds out that Saul and Jonathan have died. And that whole poem really reinforces this idea that David never meant for any ill will to come to Saul or his family.
Yeah.
That as God's anointed, David was waiting on God's action to come, but he never really wanted it. He was mourning the loss of this other appointed king, and it highlights David's integrity and commitment to what God has ordained. And so, you have those kind of things in the narrative. In the Psalms, it's a little bit different. The Psalms we generally read as sort of isolated psalms.
Yeah.
Psalm 1 is Psalm 1, Psalm 2 is Psalm 2, and there really aren't that many connections between them.
Yeah.
That in some ways that's a legitimate way to read the Psalms. In other ways, I think we're missing out on something if we just simply read them that way. And for instance, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 actually have some connections that most people would tend to miss.
Yeah.
Psalm 1 uses the term for it's that term meditate. Mm-hmm. It's translated meditate most of the time, and it's actually reused in Psalm 2, but it's translated differently.
Yeah.
And so in Psalm 1 you have it as it meditates on the law day and night, and in Psalm 2 you don't usually see it because it's translated differently. And so there are those kind of things that would really unite Psalms, but also there are topical things that would unite Psalms. I think of Psalms 95 and 96. Psalm 95 really does, it's this praise psalm to the Lord, a call for thanksgiving. And then as you look at Psalm 96, you get into something a little bit different. It's still a praise psalm, and it still extends that, but there are different aspects of the psalm that are just add to what's happened in Psalm 95. And so they're not just praise psalms kind of popped together. If you read them as a group, particularly Psalm 95 through 97, you begin to see, okay, there's a progression here. There's a movement. And whoever has placed these psalms next to each other did so with some purpose. Yeah. And so I think as we read psalms in the midst, as we read individual poems in the midst of the book of Psalms, we need to pay attention to that.
Are there connections that we can make outside of progressions in sequential psalms, where you may find a psalm, later in the psalms that has a connection to an earlier psalm, rather than that example you just gave is more of a progression?
Yeah, there are some people who would suggest that there are actually 5 books in the Psalms, and there's a lot of different sort of views on this, but some people would actually connect the first book of the Psalms being Psalms 1 through 41, book 2 being 42 through 72, book 3 being 73 through 89, book 4 being 90 through 106, and book 5 being 107 to the end. And they would suggest that those 5 major sections have been connected in various ways, but that within themselves they're actually fairly self-contained. Other people divide them up a little bit differently. I believe this comes from Paul House in his Old Testament theology. Psalm 1 is the introduction, and he talks about it as the God whose law prompts reflection. And then you have Psalm 2 through 89, and he calls that section the God whose king and people have been exiled. Psalm 90 through 145, he says the God whose kingship provides comfort. And then Psalm 1 through 46 through 50 is the God who inspires worship. And whether or not those are the right titles or the right structure or the right segment, what it's illustrating is that there are various ways that these psalms are connected. There are thematic elements that can really be drawn by reading them as groups, and it's important to take notice of those things.
Excellent. I hope that's helpful for our audience as we look at the Psalms and some of the poetic and wisdom literature type books, and we'll move on to some other things in the Old Testament here shortly. Thank you for watching.